In the hushed luxury of her private suite, Evelyn Reed lay as still as a marble statue. To the world, she was a tragedy of spent nerves and a broken brain. But they were wrong. Behind her closed eyes, Evelyn was wide awake, and she was listening to her best friend and her lawyer celebrate the stroke that finally gave them the keys to her vault. For decades, Evelyn was the epitome of grace, the widow of the Reed Steele fortune, a woman who controlled billions with a soft hand and a sharp mind. But when the stroke hit during her anniversary gala, the lights didn't go out, they simply moved out of her control. She woke up in a terrifying darkness, a prisoner in a shell that refused to obey. Doctors spoke in low tones about minimal brain activity, but Evelyn heard the truth in the hallway. She heard her best friend, Sarah, complaining about the smell of the hospital and her lawyer, Arthur, laughing as he discussed the backdated signatures they needed to finalize the theft of 20 years. The real torture wasn't the paralysis, it was realizing that her entire life had been a stage play directed by the two people she loved most. The crystal chandeliers of the Reed Manor ballroom cast 1,000 dancing fractured lights across the room, but Evelyn Reed felt only a strange, encroaching cold. It was the 20th anniversary of the Reed Foundation, a night meant to celebrate the legacy of her late husband, Thomas. At 68, Evelyn was the picture of regal composure, draped in emerald silk and the famous Reed diamonds. She moved through the crowd with a practiced, effortless grace, a woman who had spent 2 decades convincing the world and herself that she was perfectly in control. "You're overworking yourself again, Evie," a warm, familiar voice whispered in her ear. Evelyn turned to find Sarah, her best friend of 30 years, holding 2 glasses of vintage champagne. Sarah's smile was as comfortable as an old sweater, the one constant Evelyn had leaned on since Thomas's funeral. "Someone has to maintain the standards, Sarah," Evelyn replied, accepting the glass with a slight, elegant tilt of her head. Thomas wouldn't have settled for anything less than perfection. Across the room, Arthur, the family's longtime lawyer and Thomas's closest confidant, raised his glass in a silent toast. To anyone watching, they were the golden trio, the widow, the friend, and the protector, guarding a billion-dollar legacy of hope. Evelyn felt a surge of pride. She had built a fortress around her grief, letting only Sarah and Arthur inside the inner sanctum of her life. She had pushed away anyone who didn't fit the vision, including Maya, the spirited foster daughter she had taken in and then coldly dismissed 5 years ago for lack of discipline. In Evelyn's world, there was no room for messiness, only the rigid, gleaming truth of the Reed name. But as she took a sip of the champagne Sarah had handed her, the room began to tilt. The music of the string quartet suddenly sounded like it was playing underwater. "Sarah?" Evelyn gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. The concern on Sarah's face was instantaneous, yet as Evelyn's vision began to tunnel, she saw something in her friend's eyes that didn't match the panicked tone of her voice. It wasn't fear. It was a sharp, clinical focus. "I've got you, Evie," Sarah whispered, catching her as her knees buckled. Evelyn tried to speak, to call for Arthur, but her tongue felt like a heavy, leaden weight. As she was lowered to the ground, the faces of her guests blurred into a sea of indistinguishable shadows. The last thing she felt was the cold floor against her cheek and the strange, terrifying sensation of being conscious while her body dissolved into nothingness. She was the queen of the gala, the woman who controlled a fortune, and in the space of a single breath, she realized she was falling into a darkness that had been waiting for her right in the middle of her own light. The darkness was not silent, it was a cacophony of clinical indifference. Evelyn floated in a void where time had no meaning, tethered to the living world only by the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of a ventilator and the persistent, high-pitched beep of a cardiac monitor. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the suffocating weight pressing down on her chest, but her body was a tomb of emerald silk and frozen nerves. She was wide awake, her mind a sharp, jagged diamond trapped inside a statue of lead. The morning light, harsh, cold, and unfiltered, seemed to burn through her thin eyelids, though she couldn't blink to shield herself. She heard the heavy thud of the ICU door and the squeak of soft-soled shoes. "Patient Reed," Evelyn, a voice droned, devoid of any recognition of the woman who had just hours ago commanded a ballroom. Status: post-thrombotic stroke. Unresponsive to tactile stimuli. Glasgow Coma Scale remains at a 3. Evelyn felt the sharp prick of a needle, then the cold rush of fluid entering her vein. She waited for the nurse to say something kind, to acknowledge the person behind the case file, but the woman simply hummed a pop tune under her breath while checking the 4 bag. To the medical staff, Evelyn was no longer the matriarch of the Reed fortune. She was a biological failure, a vegetable in expensive linens. The brain scans show significant damage to the motor cortex, a second, deeper voice said. The neurologist, she assumed. There's no sign of conscious awareness. We'll keep her stable for the next 48 hours, but the prognosis is grim. It's a shame. All that money and nowhere for the mind to go. I am here. Evelyn screamed internally, the sound echoing uselessly against the walls of her skull. I can hear you. I can feel the cold. She tried to twitch a finger, to move even a millimeter of her lip, but the connection between her will and her muscles had been severed like a cut wire. The terror was a physical entity, a cold hand tightening around her throat. She realized with a sickening jolt that she was witnessing her own erasure. As the doctors left, the silence of the room was replaced by a more intimate horror. She heard the door click shut, and the familiar, floral scent of Sarah's perfume filled the air. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over Evelyn. Sarah will know, she thought. Sarah has known me for 30 years. She'll see the light in my eyes. But Sarah didn't take her hand to offer comfort. Instead, Evelyn felt her friend lean down, the heat of Sarah's breath ghosting over her ear. You always did love a dramatic exit, Evie, Sarah whispered, her voice stripped of the warmth it had carried for 3 decades. It was a low, chilling purr that made Evelyn's non-responsive skin crawl. Don't fight it too hard. You've had the crown long enough. It's time to let someone else enjoy the view. Evelyn lay in the terrifying stillness, the beep of the monitor accelerating. The darkness wasn't just loud, it was the sound of a predator finally dropping its mask. The door to the private suite clicked shut with an ominous finality, and the room was suddenly filled with the heavy scent of Arthur's expensive cigars. Evelyn felt the bed vibrate as someone sat on the edge, not with the gentleness of a mourner, but with the heavy entitlement of a conqueror. The neurologist is convinced, Arthur's voice boomed, no longer the respectful gravel of a family counselor, but sharp and celebratory. He's already filling out the paperwork for permanent incapacity. It was easier than we thought, Sarah. The champagne helped, Sarah replied. Evelyn heard the soft clink of ice against glass. They were drinking in her room. A little boost to the blood pressure was all it took to push her over the edge. I was tired of waiting for her heart to give out naturally like Thomas's did. Evelyn felt a coldness more profound than the stroke's paralysis. Thomas. Her husband hadn't died of a sudden, tragic heart attack. He had been murdered by the 2 people she had trusted to protect his memory. 20 years, Arthur, Sarah sighed, and Evelyn could almost see her friend leaning back, admiring her handiwork. 20 years of playing the supportive best friend, listening to her talk about her legacy, while we slowly drained the offshore accounts. Do you have the backdated signatures ready? Of course, Arthur said, the sound of rustling parchment echoing in the sterile room. The trust was always designed to be a labyrinth. By the time anyone looks at the books, the Reed Steel assets will be converted into untraceable crypto and real estate in the Caymans. We've been bleeding her dry for 2 decades, and she never suspected a thing. She was too busy looking down her nose at the rest of the world to notice the snakes in her own garden. They laughed, a dry, cruel sound that felt like sandpaper against Evelyn's soul. These were the people who had sat at her dinner table every Christmas. These were the people who had held her hand at Thomas's funeral. Every memory she cherished was a lie, a carefully constructed performance designed to keep her blind while they looted her life. "And what about the girl?" Arthur asked. "The foster daughter. Maya. She's a non-issue," Sarah dismissed. "Evelyn did the work for us years ago. She made sure that girl looked like a delinquent and a thief. If anyone asks questions about the missing funds, we'll just drop a few discovered files in Maya's name. The police will follow the trail we laid out in 2019. Evelyn wanted to hull. She had cast Maya out to protect the very people who were now using her as a scapegoat. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the paralysis. She had been the architect of her own destruction, building a fortress of pride that had only served to trap her with her executioners. "Enjoy the silence, Evie," Sarah whispered, leaning close enough that Evelyn could smell the champagne on her breath. "It's the only thing you have left." The monitor began to beep a frantic, erratic rhythm, but Arthur just reached over and turned the volume down. "Let her heart race," he muttered. "It won't be racing for much longer." The following morning, the clinical stillness of the ICU was broken by a sound that didn't belong in Sarah and Arthur's carefully orchestrated world. It wasn't the polished click of a socialite or the heavy step of a lawyer. It was the frantic, heavy breathing of someone who had run through the hospital corridors, followed by the swinging crash of the heavy double doors. "I'm sorry, miss, you can't go in there," a nurse shouted, her voice trailing off as a shadow fell across Evelyn's bed. "She's my mother," a voice cracked, raw with a decade's worth of unshed tears and unspoken apologies. "On paper or not, she's mine. Move out of my way." Evelyn felt a jolt of recognition that transcended her broken nerves. Maya, the girl she had discarded like a tarnished piece of silver, was standing at her bedside. Within the vault of her mind, Evelyn recoiled. She expected Maya to scream, to curse her for the 5 years of silence, or to mock the powerful woman now reduced to a motionless doll. "Evelyn." Maya's voice dropped to a whisper. Evelyn felt a hand, rough and warm, slide into her own limp palm. It wasn't the calculated touch of a doctor or the predatory graze of Sarah's fingers. Maya's grip was desperate, her skin smelling of rain and the cheap coffee of someone who had traveled through the night to get here. "Oh, God, Evelyn. I'm so sorry." A sob escaped the girl, and Evelyn felt the hot, heavy drop of a tear land on her cheek. It felt like a brand. "Why are you sorry?" Evelyn screamed internally. "I was the one who failed you. I was the one who chose the snakes over the daughter." The door opened again, and the air in the room instantly turned frigid. "Maya," Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and dripping with fake concern. "I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here after what you did to this family." "I don't care what you think, Sarah," Maya snapped, her voice hardening. Evelyn felt Maya's grip tighten on her hand, a protective shield forming between her and the woman who had poisoned her life. "I saw the news. I'm not here for the money or the house. I'm here for her." "You're here for a corpse that hasn't stopped breathing yet," Arthur's voice boomed from the doorway, his legal authority used like a blunt instrument. "You have no standing here. Your rights were terminated years ago. If you don't leave, I'll have security remove you for trespassing." "Then call them," Maya challenged, and for the first time, Evelyn felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since the stroke: hope. "But I'm not leaving her alone with you two. I saw the way you looked at her at the funeral 5 years ago, Arthur. I see the way you're looking at her now. Like she's a line item on a balance sheet." Evelyn's heart monitor began to spike, a rhythmic drumbeat of war. Maya didn't pull away. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against the metal rail. "I'm right here, Evelyn," she whispered into the silence. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in 20 years, the Queen realized that her fortress hadn't been built of stone and diamonds, but of the fierce, stubborn love of the girl she had once called a mistake. The standoff in the room eventually dissolved into a tense, vibrating silence after security forced Maya to step into the hallway to verify her credentials. The moment the door hissed shut, the atmosphere shifted from clinical to murderous. Arthur didn't even wait for the latch to click before he threw a thick, leather-bound ledger onto the rolling hospital tray with a resounding thud. "That girl is a loose cannon, Sarah," Arthur hissed, his voice low and jagged. "Her showing up now wasn't part of the timeline. If she stays in this room, she's going to notice things. She's already looking at us like she's measuring us for a casket." "Let her stay," Sarah replied, her voice eerily calm as she paced the length of Evelyn's bed. Evelyn could hear the soft rustle of Sarah's silk scarf, a sound that now signaled the presence of a predator. "In fact, it's perfect. We don't just need Evelyn to die, we need a ghost to haunt the accounts. Maya is the perfect ghost." Evelyn's mind raced in the dark. She listened as Arthur flipped through pages of what sounded like heavy, high-bond paper. "I've already moved the last $12 million from the Foundation's scholarship fund," Arthur whispered. "The digital trail doesn't lead to us. I've routed every login through a VPN located in the apartment Maya rented in the city 3 years ago. I've even forged a series of emails from Evelyn's private server, making it look like she discovered Maya's theft and was planning to go to the police the morning after the gala." "So," Sarah concluded, and Evelyn felt the mattress sink as Sarah leaned over her. When Evelyn finally stops breathing, the police find a heartbroken widow who is about to turn in her own foster daughter. Maya gets the blame for the stress that caused the stroke, and she gets the prison sentence for the missing millions. We walk away with a Reed legacy, and the girl Evelyn tried to save goes down as her killer. The depravity of the plan was a physical weight on Evelyn's chest. They weren't just stealing her money, they were stealing Maya's life, using Evelyn's own cold reputation to seal the girl's fate. They were turning Evelyn into a weapon from beyond the grave. "We need to finalize the transfer to the hospice in Switzerland by Monday," Arthur said, his tone turning businesslike. "Once she's out of the country and under our private care staff, we can let the final dose do its work. No autopsy, no questions. Just a tragic end to a tragic woman." Evelyn wanted to scream until her lungs burst. She had spent years believing Maya was the one who lacked character, yet it was Maya who was currently fighting security guards in the hall while the pillars of the community sat at her bedside plotting a double murder. The ledger on the table wasn't just a record of stolen money, it was a map of blood. Evelyn realized with a terrifying clarity that she was the only witness to the crime of the century, and she was trapped in a body that couldn't even weep for the girl she had so deeply wronged. The following night, the ICU felt like a hollowed-out cathedral, cold and echoing with the ghosts of Evelyn's regrets. Sarah and Arthur had retreated to a nearby hotel to handle the press, leaving a temporary void in the room that was quickly filled by a soft, rhythmic sound. It was the rustle of pages. Maya had managed to slip back in, defying the hospital's restricted hours. She didn't turn on the harsh overhead lights. Instead, she sat by the bed in the amber glow of the monitors. For a long time, there was no sound but the hiss of the ventilator. Then, Maya began to read. "I wandered lonely as a cloud." It was Wordsworth. Evelyn's breath hitched, or rather, the machine did it for her as she recognized the poem. It was the one Thomas used to recite in the garden when Maya was just a lanky, rebellious 14-year-old hiding behind the rosebushes. "I know you hated it when I was loud, Evelyn," Maya whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "And I know I broke every rule you ever set. But I never stopped reading the books you left on my nightstand. I think you left them there because you didn't know how to say you loved me without a lecture." Evelyn felt a sharp, searing pang in the center of her chest. It was a sensation of pure, unadulterated grief. Maya wasn't looking for an inheritance. She was looking for the mother who had been too proud to exist. "I'm going to stay right here," Maya said, closing the book. She reached out and took Evelyn's hand. This time, she didn't just hold it. She began to massage the stiff, frozen fingers with a gentle, persistent pressure. I don't believe the doctors, and I definitely don't believe Sarah. I can feel you in there. You're too stubborn to just leave me with those people. As Maya's thumb traced the line of Evelyn's palm, something extraordinary happened. Deep within the wreckage of Evelyn's motor cortex, a spark jumped. It wasn't the cold fury she felt for Arthur, but a warm, desperate surge of maternal instinct. She felt the texture of Maya's skin, the small scar on her thumb from a childhood accident, the warmth of her blood. The heart monitor began to skip, a rapid, syncopated beat. "Maya, look at me," Evelyn pleaded. "Don't let them take me to Switzerland. Don't let them frame you." Suddenly, Sarah's perfume invaded the room. The door swung open, and the light was flicked on, blinding Evelyn even through her lids. "Still playing the grieving daughter, Maya? It's pathetic." Evelyn felt Maya's hand tighten, but she didn't let go. "She's reacting, Sarah," Maya said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look at the monitor. Her heart rate jumped when I touched her. She knows I'm here." Sarah walked to the bedside, her heels clicking like a countdown. She looked at the monitor with a cold, analytical eye. "It's a reflex, you simple girl. A dying engine backfiring. Now, get out. The transport team arrives at dawn, and I won't have you upsetting the mercy of her final journey." Maya didn't move. She leaned down and kissed Evelyn's forehead, her lips lingering. In that moment of contact, Evelyn gathered every ounce of her soul and pushed it toward her right hand. Move. For her. Move. The pre-dawn light was a sickly, bruised purple as the transport team arrived. The room was suddenly filled with the sterile, metallic clatter of a mobile gurney and the sharp, businesslike voices of men who specialized in moving the dying across borders. Arthur stood by the window, his silhouette dark and imposing, while Sarah oversaw the removal of Evelyn's bedside belongings with the casual efficiency of someone clearing out a hotel room. "The private jet is fueled and waiting at Teterboro," Arthur said, checking his watch. "The Swiss facility has already processed the end-of-life protocol. Once she's in the air, the Reed Steel empire officially becomes a ghost story." Evelyn felt the sudden, terrifying lurch of the bed as they began to unlock the wheels. The ventilator hissed aggressively, its rhythmic beat out of sync with her racing heart. She was being packaged for disposal, a billion-dollar problem being shipped to a silent mountain in the Alps where she would be quietly snuffed out. The panic was a cold tide rising in her throat. If they moved her now, Maya would never find her. The ledger of blood would be closed, and the girl she loved would spend the rest of her life behind bars for a crime committed by the monsters currently holding the handles of her bed. "Wait." Maya's voice cracked through the room like a whip. She was standing in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her eyes bloodshot, but burning with a fierce, desperate clarity. "You can't take her. The medical power of attorney is being contested. I filed the emergency injunction an hour ago." Arthur didn't even turn around. "You filed a piece of paper that carries no weight against a 20-year-old legal mandate, Maya. You're a stranger to this estate. Now, move aside before I have these men call the police." "I'm not a stranger," Maya said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. She stepped into the room, holding her phone up like a weapon. "I've spent the night going through the digital archives Evelyn gave me access to years ago. The scholarship fund logins you used? You forgot one thing, Arthur. You used the Reed Foundation's private server, and I still have the administrative logs. Every move you made last night left a footprint." Evelyn felt a surge of pride so potent it nearly broke the paralysis. "That's my girl," she thought. "The rebel I taught to fight." Sarah's face contorted, the mask of the grieving friend finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "You're delusional. Those logs prove nothing but your own expertise in hacking. Secure the patient." "No." The order was the signal for the final liquidation. Evelyn felt the heavy hands of the orderlies shifting her weight, preparing to slide her onto the transport gurney. The physical displacement was agonizing. It felt like her soul was being torn from its anchor. As they moved her, Her head lolled to the side, and for a fleeting second, she saw Maya's face, not the face of a delinquent, but the face of a warrior. The room became a blur of motion and shouting. Evelyn knew this was the end of the line. If she didn't break through now, the Swiss silence would be her final grave. The chaos in the room intensified as the orderlies began the final transfer. The sound of Velcro straps being tightened across Evelyn's chest felt like the closing of a coffin lid. Sarah and Arthur were shouting over Maya, their voices rising in a frantic attempt to drown out the truth. But Evelyn no longer heard them. She had turned inward, retreating to the deepest, most resilient corner of her consciousness. She remembered Thomas's voice, not the way the villains had described it, but the way it had sounded when he told her that the Reed family never surrendered. She thought of Maya, not the rule-breaker, but the girl who had stayed up all night fighting a legal war for a woman who had once abandoned her. Evelyn gathered every fragment of her existence. She pulled the fury she felt for Arthur's betrayal, the grief of 20 wasted years, and the sudden, incandescent love for Maya into a single point of focus. She didn't try to move her arms or her legs. She aimed for the only part of the machine that the villains couldn't control. The heart monitor began to wail. It wasn't a steady alarm. It was a rhythmic, intentional pulse. Evelyn began to breathe against the ventilator, forcing her lungs to expand in short, sharp bursts that fought the machine's programmed cadence. "Look at the screen," she pleaded silently. "Maya, look at the screen." The alarm grew deafening. One of the orderlies paused, his hand on the gurney brake. "Wait, her vitals are spiking. Her intracranial pressure is through the roof. If we move her now, she'll code before we hit the elevator." "Move her anyway," Sarah screamed, her composure finally shattering. She reached out to grab the gurney herself, her face twisted in a mask of desperation. But Maya was faster. She shoved her way past Arthur and lunged for the monitor, her eyes wide as she watched the jagged green line. "She's doing this on purpose. Look at the pattern, Sarah. It's not a seizure, it's a response." Maya grabbed Evelyn's hand, the one Sarah had mocked as a dead weight. Evelyn felt the girl's warmth and pushed back with a force that felt like a lightning strike. She didn't just twitch, she squeezed. Her fingers clamped around Maya's hand with a strength that defied every medical prognosis in her file. The room went deathly silent. Even the orderlies backed away, their eyes fixed on the spectacle of the unresponsive woman claiming her body back. "She's in there," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face as she felt Evelyn's grip. "She's hearing every word you say." Arthur's face turned an ashen gray. He looked at the ledger, then at the girl who was now the living anchor for Evelyn's soul. The ghost had come back to life, and the machine he had spent 20 years building was beginning to tear itself apart. Evelyn didn't let go. She held on to Maya as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of vapor, preparing herself for the final, agonizing push into the light. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, a taut wire ready to snap. Arthur lunged forward, his face a contorted mask of panic, reaching for Evelyn's hand to pry her fingers off Maya. "It's a cadaveric spasm," he bellowed, his voice cracking with the first notes of true terror. "She's not conscious. Get her on the gurney now." Sarah was right behind him, her hands trembling as she grabbed the digital tablet meant to authorize the transfer. "Sign the override, Arthur. Use her thumbprint. We're losing the window." As Arthur grabbed Evelyn's wrist, his touch cold and oily, the billionaire widow felt a surge of white-hot lightning arc from her mind to her eyelids. She was no longer a passenger in her own skin. She was the storm. With a sound that was half gasp and half growl, Evelyn's eyes snapped open. The room froze. The orderlies recoiled, one of them crossing himself in a reflex of pure shock. Sarah let out a strangled scream, the tablet clattering to the floor. Evelyn's eyes, usually a cool, detached gray, were now burning with a ferocious, lucid intensity. They weren't the clouded eyes of a stroke victim. They were the eyes of the woman who had built an empire, and they were fixed directly on Arthur. "Evelyn," Maya whispered, her voice a fragile prayer. Evelyn's throat felt as if it were lined with rusted iron. The ventilator tube was a gag she would no longer tolerate. She reached up with her left hand, a limb the doctors had declared dead, and gripped the plastic tubing. With a violent, desperate wrench, she pulled. The alarms on the wall went into a sustained, shrieking panic. The nurse rushed in, but stopped dead at the sight of the unresponsive woman sitting up, her emerald silk nightgown stained with the tears of her foster daughter. Arthur backed away, tripping over the very gurney he had ordered for her disposal. It's a miracle," he stammered, his legal mind frantically searching for a new lie. "Evelyn, thank God, we were so worried." Evelyn didn't let him finish. She sucked in a raw, burning lungful of the hospital air, the first breath she had taken on her own terms in days. She looked at the nurse, then at the security guard in the doorway, and finally at the two monsters who had murdered her husband and tried to erase her life. She pointed a trembling, skeletal finger at Arthur, then at the ledger on the table. Her voice, when it came, wasn't a whisper. It was a guttural, terrifying rasp that carried the weight of 20 years of betrayal. "Police," she croaked, the word vibrating with the power of a death sentence. "Murderers." The eye of the storm had passed, leaving only the wreckage of Sarah and Arthur's greed. Sarah collapsed into a chair, her face buried in the hands that had once poisoned Thomas's tea, while Maya threw her arms around Evelyn's neck. For the first time in her life, Evelyn didn't worry about the messiness of an embrace. She simply held on, her eyes never leaving the villains as the shadows of the law finally closed in. 1 year later, the sprawling gardens of the Reed estate were no longer a curated museum of silent perfection. The sound of children's laughter drifted over the hedges, and the heavy iron gates that Evelyn had once used to keep the world at bay stood wide open. The Reed legacy had been stripped of its cold, corporate armor and replaced with something far more resilient, a home for those who had nowhere else to go. Evelyn sat on the terrace in a high-backed wicker chair, a soft pashmina draped over her shoulders. She still moved with a slight, measured slowness, a reminder of the biological war she had fought and won, but her eyes remained as sharp as the day she had woken from the dark. On the table beside her lay a newspaper from months prior, the headline detailing the final sentencing of Sarah and Arthur. They had gone to prison not just for the embezzlement, but for the evidence Evelyn had provided regarding Thomas's heart attack. The justice was cold, but it was clean. "The bus from the city just arrived," Maya said, stepping onto the terrace with 2 cups of tea. She looked different now. The defensive edge in her posture had softened, replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman who was running a multi-million-dollar foundation with both a heart and a backbone. Evelyn smiled, reaching out to take Maya's hand. She didn't need a biometric sensor to feel the pulse of a real connection. "Let them in, Maya. The West Wing is ready for the new families. Are you sure you're up for the noise, Evie?" Maya teased, squeezing her hand. "You used to say that silence was the most expensive thing you owned." "Silence was a cage," Evelyn replied, her voice now a clear, melodic shadow of its former self. "I spent 20 years surrounded by it, thinking I was safe. I didn't realize that the loudest thing in the world is the truth you're trying to ignore." She looked out at the fountain where Thomas used to sit, and for the first time in 2 decades, the memory didn't bring a sharp pang of grief, but a sense of completion. She had redeemed his name, and in the process, she had redeemed herself. She had spent a lifetime building a fortress of pride, only to find that the only thing worth protecting was the girl she had once tried to erase. As the first group of foster children spilled onto the lawn, wide-eyed at the flowers and the space, Evelyn felt a profound, humming peace. She had been the wealthy widow, a figure of envy and ice, but she was ending her journey as something much simpler, a mother. The Reed Foundation was no longer a monument to a dead man's money. It was a living testament to a woman who had been buried alive and chose to dig her way out with nothing but love and a stubborn refusal to stay silent. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the grass, Evelyn leaned back and watched Maya lead the children toward the house. She had lost her fortune to find her soul, and as it turned out, it was the best trade she had ever made.